Hello and welcome to our this week's developer meeting. Our agenda simply is as ever, we will have the introduction round, then I will give a pretty short status update so that we have enough time for the showcase hands-on, and this time we will simply start extending the platform on the top level, RESTful API in this case, and then we could have an open discussion. So let's start with the introduction round. And the first person that shows up on my list is Ismail. So Ismail, it's on you. I think you need to unmute. Okay.
So hi everyone. I'm Ismail from India, Tunisia. We work with the Mifos X 2009. And I'm happy to join you this week in your meeting. And I'm really interested about the API of Mifos X.
Okay. So next one would be the currently joined Mike.
Hi, this is Mike from Nigeria, Softfish Technologies. Just signing in. Thank you, everybody.
So Rohan. So maybe you're muted or your audio is not really working properly. So simply state your short intro to the chat. Teklu. So you're able to say something, just simply state your name, your location, and where, if you're a volunteer or something, Teklu.
Okay, can you hear me? My
Yes.
name is Teklu, and I am from Ethiopia. I am working in Ethiopia Financial Technology, and I am a software developer.
Nice. So welcome. Tengiz. Yeah, okay. So now that we've finished our short introduction round, I will give some, as I said, pretty short status updates, right? And the service pack 150301 is available, and we currently working on 150302, which will have some interest rate fixings and stuff. And we preparing this for being available at the end of next week or early first June week. So typically the plan is to have a service pack per month. Then just a nice information that is aligned with our current process to get our product management and development process a bit more straightforward. We started with the backlog triage this week, and this is simply there for qualifying all issues that we currently in Jira have, and then we will start moving them to internal projects. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, you could take a look at the video from the last developer meeting, or simply ping me on the dev list, and I could give you some answers. And one thing I would like to once again use this for call for papers. So if somebody of you is interested in giving a showcase, a hands-on, or maybe simply showing what he is doing with our platform, just ping me, and then we can set up a time slot for you where you can showcase that to all. So as I said, short and sweet so that we have enough time. We decided to start a series of hands-on just to help others, developers, and also integrators who develop a bit on our platform, to show how you could simply extend the platform without really coming in collision with our code base by simply following a few simple rules. So somebody raised his hand. So Diksha, what can I do for you? It seems you be muted, so you maybe should unmute yourself, right? Okay. So if you do not really want to say something, I mute you again. So before I start jumping the IDE, I just give you a short glimpse of what I've done as a preparation so that we do not lose that much time, right? So first of all, I followed the getting started guide and the build instructions to set up a development environment here on my machine. And for this, you typically need to create a fork on Mifos, on GitHub for Mifos, which is pretty straightforward. If you create a GitHub account and then simply fork it, and then you have your own source base for Mifos X in this case, right? And then I simply, sorry, then I simply started to have the first build, and I set up a few things which are important if you want to use it within an IDE, right? So I use IntelliJ, so I followed this, and I just simply want to show you pretty fast how you could set up that the embedded server within MariaDB in memory is running, so that you do not need to install a MySQL database if you do not want to, right? So in this case, I don't have a MySQL database running, so I'm using the embedded service. And what you need to do for this is simply create a new run configuration. I've called it Mifos Embedded, right? Then I use the server with MariaDB4j application as my main class. And in the before launch, I simply added a simple Cradle task, which is already available, right? And if you take a look here, you can see that it uses the Cradle project Mifos, then it executes only classes because that's all I'm interested in currently. And I use this specific parameter -p env equals def. And this is because if you do a normal build, then we won't put classes into it, which are typically used for development environments. And this is mainly the server with MariaDB application, and also things like the embedded Tomcat and stuff like that, because that's nothing that you really want to have in your production mode. So we have two different setups on dependencies that get pulled, and if you use the env def, then it will simply run pretty straightforward and given all these classes that you need to run it in your IDE. To prove that it works, right, I could simply say start, and then you can see down here, I make it a bit bigger, that the complete application is now running in my IDE. It uses a MariaDB wrapper for a MariaDB. And I've done this once before so that we do not wait that much long, because typically you would also update the database if you do it at the first time, and we currently have nearly 270 migration scripts. So I've just simply done this before so that we do not waste so much time, but this is how it typically shows up. And once it's up and running, right, for testing purposes, I use a pretty simple extension for Chrome, which is called Postman, where I'm able to send HTTP requests and HTTPS requests with given data, or simply retrieving stuff. So it's just an API testing call mechanism, because I'm just don't want to start writing some application on top of it, because currently we're talking only about the API and how the open API could look like. So if everything is up and running, right, I'm simply making a call to, let me make this a bit bigger so that you can see it, right? I'm simply making a call to my own localhost machine, authentication. I provide a username and a password, and I also have set some headers, right? So the only header I'm using is the Mifos platform tenant ID header default, so that the application knows with whom to talk to. And if I send this one the first time, then I will get back a complete information about the user and this little tiny piece of base 64 encoded authentication key. And this is something that we need for every other sequence call we now want to do against the application API in this case. So just to show you how this works, right? You simply add another header, authorization basic. Then we replace this key with the key I'm currently got. So, and if I now say send, I will receive information about clients. Because this is an empty test instance, there is no client, so I don't see any records here. That's why it says 0. Okay. I will open the gates for a second. So, any questions so far? Okay, so it doesn't seem like, so I will.
Marcus.
Yes.
Hello, Marcus.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah. How do you do the embedment? Is Mike? How do you do that embedment for other IDE? Like I use NetBeans. How do I do that embedment?
So in NetBeans, you should be able to in NetBeans you should be able to do the same, right? So you could simply create a run configuration, and then you need to simply say that you're executing an external task. So it should be the same steps there, right? And the important thing is, as I said, so everything. Oh, this is a bit useless because I thought it's my IDE. So the important part in this case really is this tiny little string that you saw, right? So if you go to this one here, this little tiny string, this tells Gradle in this case that you want to use another environment than you typically use. So if you set this, and you also could set it if you want to, if you start NetBeans, right, you also could send it as a -d system property, and it will also get fetched. But in this case, it would look a bit more like this. So it would be a -d, right? Project.env, and if you use this to start up NetBeans, then the project env will be set, and then it will be simply used internally also. So this is an ugly way to do it, but you also could do it in this way, right? And if you want to do it the right way, then you would simply add a external task there that you can execute with the -p for a script parameter for Gradle in this case. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, so I will proceed. What I'm trying to do with you today is starting a new API, right? And I will use the typical approach that we use internally. So we're talking about domain-driven development, which simply means we provide domain-specific layers so that we could simply really sort and make sure that business logic is where business logic needs to belong. Also, the access to data is where it belongs in the API. And for this case, we typically use 3 different kind of layers, which is the API layer, in our case, purely RESTful. Then we have the service layer, which encapsulates all those business logic and also does the audit trailing and some more sophisticated security and stuff like that. And at the bottom, I'm sorry, we have the data layer, which simply holds the object relational mapping, provides some repositories that you can fetch data, also takes care about the integrity of data, and provides some simple caching based on the Hibernate second level cache. So this is pretty straightforward, and the series we're talking about will really start from top to bottom. And this is mainly for the reason if you really want to start writing an extension, then you have 2 portions that you take a look at. One is the server side and the other one is the UI side. And typically you try to find your contract for the interface, in this case the API, so that the UI guy can start working on it while you start implementing all the rest, right? Instead of telling him, okay, now you need to wait 2.5 weeks before you can start, right? And then you start the iteration after you completely implemented it the whole way through. Typically, you would start with the API layer and mock this so that he can start creating his UI. And you can simply build out the functionality below it while he's already starting working with it and maybe giving you feedback and say, hey guys, come on, this is not really easy. Why we could not do it this way or that way, right? So that's the idea behind it. So that's the reason why we start with the API layer, and we're creating a pretty simple mocked version today. In the next series, then we will start the service layer, and this then will really start bringing some business logic in it and also starting the data layer and stuff like that. So, are there any questions so far? This doesn't sound like a question. Okay. So I simply will mute you all again. So the idea I'm currently having is I want to have something like a consumer API where I'm able to create a consumer, where I'm able to list available consumers and activate a consumer. So this is pretty simple the way I want to go through it, right? And I don't want to mess around with all those internal classes, because I know once I start changing them, I could get in trouble if some code base changes from the Mifos code base comes back. So the first thing I do, right, and this is pretty straightforward for most of us, is I create my own package. And because we're in something like a lab currently, I will call it lab. So I got my lab package here. And if you take a look at how we typically structure our architecture, that's something that I also could show you. So working with code, right? We typically have a pretty straightforward architecture, right? So the domain is always org Mifos platform, then a module or a functional area would come, and then we would have some submodules which respect the layers that we're currently talking about. So the API and the data layer is specifically for the service layer, for the RESTful API layer. Then we have something like domain, and we have resources, repositories that are then for domain-specific data parts. Then we have the service and handler, which reflects the service layer and the command processing. And then you could have packages like util, where you simply have some helper utility classes, and you have your annotation, where you maybe could create your own annotations if you want to do some more sophisticated stuff. That's something that we could take off topic if somebody is really interested in digging deeper into Spring and how to use annotations, but that's not covered here right now. So for our case, right, we said, okay, lab, because that's our current restriction. We do not want to mess around with all the other packages. Then we simply create a package which is called data. And this will be the package for all transported information. So all objects, all JSON objects at the end of the day that contains data that is given by the client or we transfer back to the client. And we also will create a second package, which we call API, right? And this is the package that holds the resources for all RESTful APIs. So everybody is clear about what I'm doing here? Okay, so if everybody is clear, I can proceed, right? So the first thing I would do, and I will do in this case, is I would create my class that is my transport class for consumer information, right? The name scheme we use is the name of the entity or portion that we want to send. And we typically call it data so that you can really see the difference between the consumer data, which is sent to a client, and later on the consumer as an entity, which is more part of the data layer, which, as I said, will come in one of the next parts. So yes, I will. So as one of the best practices I can recommend, I simply would always use a external unique identifier that is human readable, right? So usually if you start something like a CRUD-based implementation, then you're pretty fast starting to exposing internal IDs, which maybe could change for any reason, right? So typically they won't change because there should be the primary key, but for any reason they could change. So what I would typically do is I would typically have a external unique ID. This is given by the client and which is simply helps him human readably to discover the API by things that he's using. So my first thing would be a private string. In this case, I will simply call it unique identifier. Then I think it also would be good to have a first name and a last name so that you can pretty simply see who the customer is, right? Private string, last name. And because we know we want to differ between an active and a not active consumer, we simply have a Boolean here, which is called active, right? And then just for the sake of completeness, right, private date last modified. So this would be the first shot of our nice little data that we send back and forth to the client, right? Because I'm lazy, I will use some of the nice nitty-bitty helpers that the IDE gives me, so I do not need to type that much. And I also will have getters and setters for all. So the nice thing about Spring and JAX-RS, which we're using for all these transferring data back and forth to the client, is that the object that you're using is a simple POJO, a simple plain old Java object. There's no tricks, nothing else. You could simply write this, and once you're given it to the API and send it out or receive it, the serializer which is used will simply take this and make a JSON object out of it. So there's no special need for us currently to do anything, just to have this one serialized to a client back and forth. So is everybody clear on what I'm doing here?
Yeah, well, we're good.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
good anyway.
Yes, we are fine.
Okay, so next step would be simply to create my resource, right? So I would simply go into my API package and I create a consumers API resource. So the name reflects, and that's the reason why it's plural, not singular. It's the name reflects the resource that we want to map it to, right? So the resource, typically, if you take a look at RESTful APIs, resources are always in plural, so that you see that there are not one consumer. It's just simply a list or a collection of consumers that you're now addressing to. And we try to reflect this also by using a name scheme that fits to that. So if somebody sees the class consumers API resource, he's aware that we will find a /consumers on the HTTP part somewhere, right? So that's pretty the reason why. So, and now we simply start some magic, right? So the first thing we do is we use a annotation which is called component, and it comes from Spring Framework. So this is simply something like a marker, right? So we mark this class with the component annotation so that Spring is able to pick it up because we tell him this is a class that we want you to have in your bean context. So that's the reason why we use component. There are other ones. So you also have a service, which is a specific version of a component that tells Spring that we're talking about a service. So currently there's no special handling, but there's still plannings for having different types of treatments for different types of components. And another one that you will find is repository. So typically add repository is used if we're talking about the data layer. Add service is used if we're talking about service classes. And add component is just a generic version of everything, because there is a annotation which is called add rest controller, but it adds a bit more behavior than that we would typically like to see. That's the reason why we simply skip back to add component. So pretty straightforward. Now Spring should know that there's a class consumers API resource that it needs to register to his Spring Bean context. So the next thing we typically do is we add a scope. So scope is typically twofold. So you could have a scope prototype, which means every time somebody is asking for an instance using a Spring auto-wired mechanism, it will create a new version of it. Or you could say the scope should be singleton. In this case, it's treated like a singleton. It's not really a singleton. It's just one instance that is wrapped by a proxy, and you simply get the same instance all the time. So it's not really a complete singleton pattern, but it expresses the singleton pattern. And this is typically how we treat our consumer API resources, because we don't want to have how many ever instances of that running around, because that's our API and that should be only one resource there. So what we typically do is we simply state singleton, right? So now Spring knows there's a component I need to pick up, and it knows, oh, it's a singleton, so I need to initiate it only once and never, and everybody else will use this. Given this fact, you need to be very, very, very careful if we're talking about class members variables, right? Because if it's a singleton and somebody is changing your class variables, then the next call maybe would do something totally unexpected because there are some class variables there. So typically, you do not really use class variables if you're using a singleton, or you at least are 100% sure you know what you're doing, okay? So, as ever, we will have a constructor, right? And that's it for now. So now we will have our nice little consumers API. So what I propose to do is, right, always prepare a logger. And we typically use internally the SLF4J because it's the logger that also is used by Spring, so that you can be sure that everything that you're doing is in the same log file. But you also could create now, if you like, to your own log files and start searching if you're interested in searching through log files. So, and now let's take a look if everything works as we expect it to. Right, so we simply put a static block in here. This is nothing you would typically do if you start writing production ready code, but I just want to really make a short round of taking a look at how things work. So now I have my static block, and the only thing I want to do is simply I want to say logger info, and I simply want to say something like consumer API resource class get simple name plus registered to bean context. So my expectation would now, if this class got instantiated, the static block is run once. So I need to see logger.info somewhere in my log output there. So what I will do now is simply say quit, right? So quit the current version that's running. And I will now simply start it again. And then I will see if my So this warning is not really bad because I'm using Java 8 here and I'm telling the compiler to use Java 7, so he's a bit complaining about that, but it's okay. So there's no harm that happens to my implementation here. So while this thing is booting up, does somebody have any questions so far so that we maybe could use that time waiting for it just to simply answer some questions?
But what about this part, this GPI resource? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in another part of the code, there is no such thing happening like logger. There's only like static resources which are just showing that or mapping, I would say.
So you will find this logger part pretty often, right? So even if you go a bit deeper.
Why are we using logger in it?
We're using the logger so that you can simply put log outputs into the log file so that you can see if something has happened, right? So first of all, typically you will use it if you're having some errors where you simply want to print a bit more information out than only the exception itself, right? Or simply maybe there's no exception at all because it's simply sucked. So usually you would use the logger for error printing, and also if there's some conditions that are not really fit but do not harm the system, then you would use warn. And I simply use it here only to showcase if my little nice thing is now got catched or not, right? So I'm telling him there's a consumer API component scope, right? And I just want to make sure that the Spring context really took it up. So it's more for showing that something is happening or not. And as you currently see, that's the reason why I've done it, right? So it's simply straightforward. As you can see, it's not really picked up somewhere. So I could not find the consumer API resource in my log. So something went wrong, right? So it looks like Spring doesn't really recognize my component. Okay?
Okay.
So yes.
I mean, yeah, but why, I mean, yeah, I got the point of using a logger, but I mean, in other parts of the area, I mean, like if you see the like clients API, clients resource API, right? So they don't actually have anything called logger either.
Yeah, but that's mainly because most of those APIs are made pretty fast, right, and pretty old, so nobody really used a logger there. But if you take a look at some service classes, then you will find loggers. And also if you take a look at more internal classes, you will also find loggers. Right? So it's just a back.
Yeah, internally there are few places that have used logger, but I get your point of using logger just so that you can check something. You know, we've added something, you want to see, right? That is it taking it or not, right?
Yeah, and also if you want to have a bit more information if something went wrong, right, then you would use a logger. Well, but because in the other way you simply will have a stack trace and no more information in there. So the logger is your help to get a bit more information or to send a bit more information before something went wrong, or simply if you want to show some debugging options, right? So if you say the logger should be in debug mode, so I can see if somebody entered a method and stuff like that, then you can use that. And so it's more a good thing if you want to start using it in production instead of debugging it all the time, right? So if there's something running wrong in your instance and you have decent debugging message, then you could simply change the level and see what happens.
Okay.
Okay.
That is good.
Okay. So somebody else raised his hand. So, Rohan, what do you mean by level? I'm level, the log level? Yeah, so I'm referring to the info level, right, which is a bit not that low as debug, and then you still have the debug, which is typically not enabled, so we're typically run on info level, and that's the reason why I choose info, because you won't see anything if I choose debug here, and then you got warn and error, so that's typically the 4 levels the logger is typically offering you.
Okay, warning, info, and error, right?
Yeah, you got, if you take a look here, right, you got debug, you got info, you got error, and you got warn. Oh, you also got trace, which is even lower than debug. So if you really want to start tracing some stuff, then like what parameters were sent and stuff like that, then you could do it on a trace level, right? So that's the 5 levels that are supported. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. So I've unmuted you all again, so please raise your hand if you have a question. Next step is to answer the question, why does it not really got picked up, right? So we thought we made everything right. So we have our Spring annotations here, and we told it it's singleton, but it doesn't pick it up. So that's mainly the question. So we're using some XML configurations here, right, that you can find below resources meta-inf Spring. And the main resource that the main configuration that we're using is the app context. So the app context is typically the place where everything that we do specifically is set up. And as you can see here, there is a context component scan, which is pretty restrictive. So we really use base packages, pick and choose, and tell Spring what to pick up. And because I've introduced a new package, which in this case is lab, it's not available here, so it won't get picked up, and so Spring doesn't know anything about my awesome new class, right? So now I got 2 options. One option would be I could simply add it into this one and maybe get in conflicts once I start pulling new changes from the main code base, because if somebody else is changing something here, then it will simply fail all the time, or I need to merge it and need to decide or stuff like that. Or the other way I could do it is I could simply create my own context and use an import statement here, which is easier to maintain at the end of the day, because if I start having more packages here and also starting having JPA repositories here, then I need to always remind myself where that stuff is. So it's definitely easier if I simply create my own context and simply import it. So it's only one line of code that I need to maintain if I really got in a conflict there. Right, so this is also pretty straightforward. I simply say new file, right, and I call it extension context.xml. And mainly because I'm lazy, right, I will copy paste some of that stuff and remove what I do not need. Right, so let's get this thing over there. And let's close beans. All right. So all I need now, right, and this is pretty straightforward. So all I need now is, first of all, a context. And in this case, I want to have the context annotation configuration, because I want to make sure that the annotations get picked up, right? And this is mainly so that if you want to use your extensions exclusively for anything else, right, then at least this makes sure if you only use the extension context XML, that the stuff that you wrote is also picked up. And then I use the context component scan, which is also pretty straightforward. And in my case, it's simply org.mifosplatform.lab. So because I'm lazy, right, I don't want much more. So this little line of code here now tells the Spring Bean Factory that there's a package which is called org-mifosplatform.lab. And because I simply did not specify anything else, it will simply make a recursive skip through all those child packages of this. So that's pretty simple for me in this case, just to have it there, right? So if I start moving around some stuff because I maybe made some package changes, I do not really need to care about that anymore. And as you can see now, there's a lot of stuff which is outgrade because it's not used, and I typically don't like that being outgrade, so that's why I simply remove all that stuff that it's not used, because the rest is already provided by the platform, and I don't need it there anymore. Oops, this was the wrong one. So is everybody clear? Oh, somebody raised his hand. Nice. So, Saranj, what can I do for you?
Yes. Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, sorry. Yes?
Yeah. First thing I would wanted to ask you that you are so lazy. Okay, anyways. So do we have to all the time, create this extension context.xml for any component added into it?
No, so you would do this only once, right? And then you would simply add all your components there. So this is your special context configuration if you don't want to mess around with ours, right? So
okay. So if yeah, I got it. So if app context.xml is the core part and this is the extension of that, right?
Right. So then all you need to do then is simply go over here, right, and copy one of those lines and simply add your extension XML there, and then you're good.
Okay.
So what now happens is we call Spring once we start it up, right? We tell Spring that the application context is the one that he needs to look for, and this import statement tells him once you're done with all that stuff here, please import the extension context XML, which is this one. And here we tell him, oh, there's another base package which is called lab, right? So the only line you really need to take care about in the future, right, is this one. So if you pull in changes,
Import.
right? Because if you now pull in changes and somebody changed the same line, then you maybe get an merge conflict, but then it's pretty simple and straightforward, right? Because you only need to hit this line again and you're good, instead of finding the right lines where you need to add your stuff before. But okay?
Okay.
All right. So now if we start our embedded server once again, then it should pick up our nice little consumer API resource. Oh, something went wrong. Nice. Oh, an error occurred while installing the database. Okay. So this sometimes happens specifically because we use a wrapper around that database, right? And sometimes it doesn't really pick it up correctly. And because it's a development environment, it's not really that hard. So what you need to do in this case is simply you need to clean it once, right? So that the complete source path is over, and then you need to restart it again. But this then will take a bit longer, right? So if we start it now, then it should simply start. But now doing the complete migration of the database once again.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. We can use the
I have
time.
a question. Yep. So basically, we guys were thinking that extensively we guys are using this MySQL database in it. What about the part is there anything which we can do something on NoSQL? Like, we can implement this whole database on NoSQL. Is it possible?
Currently, no.
I mean, if we do something like implement something on Mongo or something like this? Not available.
It's currently not available, right? Because if you take a look at the code, you will see that we use native SQL statements, right? So you
Yeah,
couldn't.
we have to actually change those native SQL statement, right?
If you use a MongoDB, then you maybe do not need any of those native SQL statements anymore, right? So
Right.
what you can do is you can set up a MySQL a NoSQL, so in this case maybe a Mongo or Cassandra or whatever you want to look for, right? You can take this one as a
Right.
extension and store some information there and simply gather them together in your services. That's something that you can do, but you could currently you're not able to switch the database. So we're planning to have some effort there to ease that, right? So that you can use at least multiple RDBMSs, but typically not really supporting NoSQL databases because most of the stuff that we're doing is really relational, so it's not really document or object oriented. So the relational databases are still a bit better, but not really cacheable, and that's maybe the reason why you want to use a MongoDB, right? Simply to
Right.
have it cached, right? So there's
Right. So that the speed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah. So that the speed, the whole thing process gets ease, and we can have the, because if you see the efficiency is the important. I mean, it takes a lot of time. I mean, the MySQL.
Yeah, that's mainly because I'm now migrating it once again, right? But once you're up, then it's typically not really that hard, right? It's simply the first structure that we currently now pump into the database, right? And all the changes on that structure. And that's something that you also need to facilitate for Mongo, right? So if you once have your first setup of schemes, right? Or key stores or whatever you want to call it, and you start changing that, then you also need to have a migration. In this case, we use Flyway to do that, right? That's the reason why it takes so long the first time to set it up, because we treated our initial database schema as the real schema, and every change we now do is simply a change on the schema. So that's the reason why we simply have 260 or whatever migration schema changes, just to make sure that the database is updated pretty well and not simply providing a new SQL statement all the time. Right, that would be the other case. You could also say we simply give you a SQL statement that creates the current version of it, but then it would not really be managed in any way. And so we're managing all changes in our code base.
Okay, another question is that about while it is happening, so about the API version 1. So because we're thinking that, implementing a new level of security, like, providing an access token in the browser so that instead of giving the username and password, because I mean,
yeah,
as we are moving towards new level of authentication, so can we do that? Is it like, if we try to mess up with the codes, then can we get ahead with this part?
So we currently have a OAuth 2 implementation in the pipe.
Right.
Right.
We don't want to. Yeah. I mean, as you can see, people can just simply log into it, right? And that's a security glitch, I would say.
Yeah. So, as I said, we currently have the OAuth 2 implementation in pipe, so it's already there, but it's not available, right? Because this would be the first time that we start changing the version number of the API. So currently we have an API v1, right? And if we start introducing a new, in this case, authentication authorization mechanism, then we decided to have an API version 2 so that you can use version 1 for yourself again, right? But if you want to switch to a more secure version of authentication than basic authentication, you could simply use OAuth 2 then. So it's already there, but we did not put it to public. That's something which will come with the 1506. So with 1506, you will be able to also do OAuth, which then is simply a authentication token mechanism, right?
Right.
Two-legged in this case.
We guys were thinking of implementing something like this.
We already have it implemented.
you already have implemented it.
Right, and it will be available with the next release, right? So it's there, but it's
Okay.
not how to say, right? It's not really public. We did not make it public to anybody to tell that we have OAuth because we first want to test it internally, right? And it's already there. So with the next release, you also will have OAuth 2 implementation.
Okay, so we don't. Yeah.
And then you have a more sophisticated version of authenticating to the service instead of basic stuff, right?
Okay.
So any more questions?
Not right now.
Not right now. That sounds at least nice.
Hello, Marcus.
Yeah.
Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
Sam complained about that he's still having issues with overpayment in loan, and I thought that was solved some time ago. I think he called that he made an overpayment on a loan, and then when he was trying to make another payment, the system refused to add that payment because there was an overpayment, and then from there he now started getting some funny errors on the repayment.
Yeah, I think there's still some bug fixes already there, right? And I think they're already in the pipeline. So once the 15.03.02 is out, I think some of that overpayment issues also should be gone.
Okay.
Okay. So as you can see,
Now it's coming up.
right. Thanks, Saranj. Right. So as you can see, now it's there. So we use the
Yeah.
extension context here specifically to tell him this is our specific package that you need to take a look at, and now he's finding it. Okay.
Okay.
So we do not need this static stuff here anymore. It's just simply to showcase it. And just for the sake of it, because we only got 2 more minutes before this meeting is over, I will simply do a pretty straightforward implementation for a get. Right? So what I want to do now is pretty simple, fetching a list of all consumer data which are there. So fetch all and because, as I said, we will mock this, right? I'm simply creating a private final. No, let's use a hash map. So we have keys later on. A hash map, which will contain a string and consumer data. Mocked consumer data. So as I said, pretty straightforward, right? In this case, okay. So I don't want to mess around with that for now. So let's have a collection and remove that list. Okay. So there are a few pieces missing now, right? So the first one is I need to tell the implementation where it can find my resource, because I didn't specify any path there, and currently it's simply a bean which hanging around somewhere and it's not really used, right? So for this we decided to use Java X implementation, the Java X RS implementation, instead of relying on Spring internal stuff so that we maybe could transmit to another container without really having a lot of issues there. So if I would use something like add request mapping now, then I would need to make sure that everything is there and that there's some bridge between Java EE and Spring. So that's the reason why we decided to use the JUX RS annotations, because Spring understands them, and we could also, if we want to in the future, transmit to a Java Enterprise server without that much effort by changing millions of code lines, right? So that's the reason why we decided to use the JUX RS things here. And in JUX RS, it's pretty simple because we're talking about the path, right? So you use the path annotation, and we could simply say now consumers. So now the complete class consumer API resource is simply mapped to consumers resource on the HTTP portion of the service. And now I simply say here get, because I know that the fetch all will be an HTTP GET request. Anything else wouldn't really make sense because I want to have it pretty discoverable for somebody, right? And what I also do is I add some consumes here, right? So in this case, I will simply allow star star, right? Because that's, I don't see any reason for a get to be restricted to any specific type. So typically if somebody's doing a get, he also can use a browser. So that's the reason why I use star star here. So I don't care about what the guy is asking for, right? So if it's an application JSON or if it's text HTML, so I allow everything. And the only thing I already return, right, is simply saying I just want to return application JSON, right? So I tell somebody that I will produce application JSON and I will consume any request here because I do not expect any input. So I don't care about what he will sending me because I'm not really interested in what's happening there. So, and given the fact that I did not specify a path here, this complete fetch all method is simply mapped to the consumers as a GET request. So far, questions?
No, let's try this thing.
So good.
Yeah, let's try that thing is nice. Yes, we will try it.
Yeah.
Okay, so just simply rerun it.
Okay.
So just to be fast.
It's fairly simple. I mean, now you have demonstrated it's fairly simple.
Yeah, that's I think that's one of the main points I just wanted to show, right? So there's a lot of magic happening, and some people are scared and afraid, and oh my God, what the hell I need to do there, right? And once you see how simple it really is, then it's really pretty straightforward doing it. Because there's no tricks and no extras. If you understand those annotations a bit and what they're doing, then it's pretty, oh, come on. This is unbelievable. Okay, it's once again failing. So I messed something up with my stuff. Okay, so clean once again, and then it will take a bit longer. And while it's building, we also could do something like public whatever response, where is it? JUX core response. Let's call it create consumer, right? And we will have a final consumer data, consumer. And for this pretty straightforward implementation, this put IP will be my unique ID, and the value simply will be the consumer data itself. And now I will return response dot So as you can see, this is also pretty straightforward, right? So I simply said I want to create a consumer by extracting my consumer data, right? And for my mocked implementation, I simply put the consumer unique ID as my key and the consumer data as my data. And I simply respawned a created 201 so that somebody who is creating it simply knows that it worked. And what I need to do now, and with a post, right? Then I will tell that I am allowed the consumation only for application JSON, right? So because I want to have an application JSON now, and I will produce an application JSON. So that's it. And now we could simply try to run our nice little tool again and see if it works.
So these are the data which you are simply putting, and then if somebody wants to, I saw the architecture, if somebody wants to have what is the part of command? Why do we use command in it?
So we use command currently nowhere there, right? Because it wouldn't make sense to have a command there. But for example, right? Let me give you an example. Public response process command, right? Final string unique identifier and final string command. Okay, so this would also be a post, and it will have a specific path. In this case, it will have slash unique identifier, and I'm lazy, copy pasting. Star, because we do not really need something here. So, and now it would be path param. And we would have at query parameter. So what I'm doing here is hopefully pretty clear, right? So I will explain some of that stuff now. So accept it. So what I'm doing is I'm extending the path consumers, right, with a unique identifier, which is in this case the identifier currently given when creating these little nice little consumer data, right? So I'm using the add path parameter to let the framework inject me the unique identifier, right? So somebody's writing something like 111 here, then the framework simply will add 111 here into my string without me needing to take care about that, right? And the second portion, I'm doing here is I'm simply saying, okay, I'm expecting a command, which is a query parameter. So somebody is writing command equals something, right? And because we talked about activating, I would simply have a command equals activate, right? And for now, there's not really some hard magic happening here, right? So what I would do pretty straightforward would be if this mock consumer contains key unique identifier. In this case, not, right? So if somebody gave me a identifier which I do not know, right, I simply return a 404 not found because he asked for a resource I do not know, right? And otherwise, I would simply say final consumer data equals this mocked consumer data get my unique identifier, and then I say consumer data set active. So for this mocked implementation, right, there's no real need for have commands because I'm now working simply on some consumer data, right? But the idea of a command is, first of all, the person who is using your resources do not really need to take care about those complete data sets all the time, because if you typically do this in a CRUD way, right, so create, read, update, delete, you would expect an update to also send a complete consumer data that you then completely update, right? That's something that you typically would not do if you simply say, I want to activate, or I want to deactivate, or I want to delete it, right? So that's typically pretty simple command patterns that you use. And now you have two options how you can do it. One option would be simply go to the database, fetch your consumer data, change that value, right? And simply throw it back. Or you could use a command which typically would be asynchronous because you're say, okay, as I've done here, right, it's accepted. So I will do what you ask me for, but let's see when, right? And in this case, you could simply have a pretty straightforward command, which then is simply called activate consumer. And this is doing the trick there. And at the end of the day, it would still fetch the information and grab it. But the main plus that you get if you use the internal commands that we provide is that you have an audit trail. So we internally audit all information that you use, that you change or delete or whatever using commands is automatically audit trailed, so that you exactly see at any point of time who has done what, right? And that's something that you can simply buy in because you're using a command. Okay. Am I alone already? No, it doesn't look like it.
Yeah.
So let's see if this works now, right? So send should be the same because the session doesn't change, but we make sure that it really works before we ask for something else. And now send. Okay. And now we want to fetch our consumers. And I hope that we will get a empty list. Right. So because we got no consumers there, right? Now we could simply do a post raw. It's JSON, we know it. So now there's some typing, right? So we have the unique identifier which simply is mage. Then we have first name, which simply is Marcus. Then we have the last name, which simply is my last name. All right. So I'm just simply sending the unique identifier first name and last name here, right? Because we told
you not close the quote on one of your parameters, the last name.
Yeah, right. Danke. So because we're telling him here we are expecting consumer data, he will automatically map that, right? So I do not need to specify consumer data or something. The only thing I need to specify is which of those things I want to set, right? That's all. So I want to set the unique identifier first name, last name. I don't care about active and I don't care about last modified. So active will be false, hopefully, right? And date will be also null. Oh, both will be null because they're real objects. So if I go back now and I send it, it would fail because I typically do not send the right media type, right? I told him here that I will only expect application JSON, right? And I did not send application JSON as a specific type. So what I need to do once again is I need to add one more nice little header, which simply says application JSON. And now I should be able to send it. And it tells me created. So if I go back now and say get, I should get my one identifier back, right? And as you can see, active is null and last modified is null. And now if I go over here and say mage, I will do a post and I will do a command equals activate. There's no logic for it to prove this, but at least it should work now. So I will now definitely send a command to mage and say activate, send. I get a 404 not found. That's nice. So see, now it's a good point for having some loggers. Unique identifier, command. I know the reason why, because I started the server before I really was finished with this freaking freaking method, darn. Okay, so, but at least you will know that it worked, right? So I simply started the server before this method was done, so he didn't pick up the class changes because I didn't rebuild it. That's it. So I would like to wrap this up for now, right? So the next time we will take up this implementation and simply create the services for it, and then we will start putting stuff like commands and handlers and all that stuff into it. So do you have any questions so far? Or any wishes for the next time? So what I will do is, just for the sake of us, right? I will commit those changes and push it to my GitHub fork so that you can simply pull it and take a look at it and ask questions if you like to. So I will call this, the branch will be called DevLab, so that you could simply use this branch and follow what I have done.
Okay.
Okay.
So can we ask some questions?
Yes.
Do we have some time?
I think we still have some time to ask some questions, right? So we're 20 minutes over, and so I don't really care about more minutes being over.
Okay, so I have this question. Talking about this, the way the code is working, it's fairly simple. So, and since we people are going to build some mobile, solution or self, service thing, which is going to provide the, general, user to book their loans on their own, right?
Yeah.
So we guys were, so do we have to, do we have to develop some new mobile-based APIs, or we can use the existing ones?
So you can currently, by using some weird tricks, you also could use you could use the current API, right? But in this case, then you would simply do the trick and make the client/consumer to a restricted staff member, which is something that you really do not want to do, right? Because
Right.
they're typically no staff, but that's one way you can do it. And another partner currently is working on a self-service application that should be pushed within the next 2 or 3 months. Right, and they also will fix the problem of the consumer being a real consumer instead of being a staff.
So can we, I mean, like, can our team work together in this part? Because see, you guys are also implementing this important issue about the mobile related, because our company is looking forward for this mobile, resources.
So what I can do is I can simply ask the other partner if he's willing to share and combine with you.
Yeah.
Right? And if he's willing to, then I could simply give your details so that he can team up with you.
Okay. And about the, I would really like to know what are the, roadmap, the real roadmap. I mean, something which you have written, not something which you have written on the web. I would really like to know the real roadmap. Where are you guys taking this particular Mifos X?
Yeah. So
the code base and all other things.
So I can change. I think I already shared, right? But I also can share a document I set up a while ago. Right. Give me a second. That's something I really could do, so that's not really a problem. So I'll go to Drive. I've already documents, internal, is it projects? I'm not sure. No, so I will find this document and then I could simply send it to you, right? So there it is. So this is just a statement of where I see where we need to take that, right? And what parts will be there. So as you can see, there's a lot of stuff we're talking about, right? Like scalability and in event sourcing, so that we really could have OAuth already is there, right? Then we want to allow an encryption of decryption of a superset of data within the database, right? And in memory, NoSQL data store.
What is this superset of data?
Yeah, so if you have a customer which is really keen about his data, right, and says, I want to make sure that some of my client or all of my client data, even in the database, is encrypted in the database. So if somebody is able to jump into my system and violate anything, right, and is able to read my data, then some data should be encrypted in the database so that he's not able to read it without having the right decryption key. Right. So then we, as you already saw, we also thinking about adding a in-memory NoSQL data store so that we can have faster and better querying of data. So we would use the RDBMS still to write data, right? But we would have some in-memory SQL store to simply have faster read capabilities based on the views you're looking for, because there are JSON objects, and these JSON objects can simply be stored in a memory NoSQL database, right? Then we will provide a plugin mechanism, right, which makes it easier for you to change code instead of messing around with our code base. So the current way that I showed you is not that harmful for you, because all you will do aside the typical code we're doing, but the overall goal is to provide a way that you can simply set up your own project and put it in the code base as a plugin without really need to mess around with our code.
So how do we do that? The plugin mechanism, how it's gonna work?
So currently we're thinking about providing a framework where you could simply pull all the artifacts that you need, right, as the starting base, and then you create your own module and compile everything, and then you're good, right? So that's the idea.
Okay.
And this is more some nice to have, right? Providing a JavaScript library that helps easier integration of that stuff.
Okay.
And one other step would then be simply modularizing what we currently have. But currently we have one huge set of information, right? And maybe you're not interested in most of that stuff we're looking for. So we're really looking for providing modules like a core module, a accounting module, a portfolio module, a loan module, so that you can pick and choose what you really want to use. And one other thing would be then providing a Java API client, a client API. So if you want to, instead of using a single page application like, let's say, Angular or Knockout or whatever, you just want to use JSP, JSF, right? Then we would also like to offer a client API that you can simply use there without the need to go over the REST HTTP portion all the time.
Okay.
So that's the.
And what about the part? What about the part which you mentioned, like machine learning and the business process workflow? There is nothing like that.
Right. that came up a bit later, right? So that's something that we also need to mingle in here, right? So that this one is, I don't know. I think it's it's from February 2, right? And we already started to increase this one and put more stuff in it. So that's also part of what we'll do. So I will provide that. Okay. So maybe I need 2 or 3 days to really provide a decent roadmap there where you can see what will come up, and then I will simply share it.
Okay, that is great. That is really good. Anything else you would like to add in it?
I'm currently pretty good. If we really have those modularization, and we also have a workflow engine and the rules engine there, and some of those machine learning Waco stuff we talked about, right? I think we're pretty good then, specifically if we're allow you to create your own modules without putting them into our code base. Right? Then I think we're on the right path there. So currently we're just having a monolith, right? And we force you to implement in this monolith. And this is something that we definitely want to change in the near future.
So that is the path of around, I guess, 1 or 2 year, 1 or 1.5, 2 year, right? I guess.
I'm not sure. So specifically those modularization and the framework approach I talked about, right? So the idea we currently have, it's a bit like Spring Framework, so that you could simply set up your project with Gradle or Maven, right, and pull in, let's say, something like a Mifos core module and a Mifos accounting module that you can simply use.
It's like a library, I would say. It's like provided in an header or something like this. So
and you could simply pick and choose, and then
So, Marcus, have you gone through this software called OpenERP?
Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, Marcus, have you gone through this open source software called OpenERP?
No.
It's you can actually have a look at their architecture. You can go to the OpenERP. And the Odoo, this open source ERP and CRM, right?
Yeah.
It's that. Yeah. It's something very, similar, I would say. And the code base, the architecture, it's really very similar, which you guys are like actually planning to. And it's entirely based on Python. You can have a, it's like the modularize the way you want it to have, like you want to have models, so it's very similar.
Yeah.
But it's actually based on Python. It's and the way you were talking about the plugins, like there's something you want to develop of your own, so you can you can do the similar thing
Yeah.
using this.
So we're currently also,
Yeah.
so if you take a look at OpenMRP, right, which is something like a sister, oh no, OpenMRS, I'm sorry, OpenMRS, right, which is something like a sister project of us, right, then you can see that they also
What is
provide
this? What is this? What is this OpenMRA?
OpenMRS, right? They also Java based and they also have a modular system. So that's the way we're currently maybe also like to go to. But that's something, as I said, let me send out the roadmap and give you a bit more detail on what I'm looking for, and then we can start another discussion around that.
Yeah, sure, why not? See, Marcus, we have a team of people, those who can actually get involved in it. So that's why I'm asking these sort of things.
Yeah, that would be nice if we could have some contributions from others there too, right? So we need to provide the way we want to go, right? And also we need to provide the way we want to architecture it. And if somebody then says, "Oh, I see myself there, so I can pick it up and do it," I'm totally fine with it.
Okay. So anything else you might want to add?
Currently, no. I'm good, and I think we're 30 minutes over.
I am sorry for taking time.
That's no problem.
I asked a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's good, right? And otherwise, it would just be something like a fronted educational thing, and I don't like that.
Yeah,
I'm
which happens at colleges, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for today's session.
Yeah, you're welcome. And now we'll wrap it up. So thanks for attending.
Yep.
And I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day, whatever, if it's short or long.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Marcus.